Hey, it's your old buddy Zombie Tactics again with something a little different today. I pride myself on doing things that you're not going to see on any other gun, gear, knife, tactical, Blue Blaze irregular channel. and This is kind of in the context of talking about what's going on in our world and how we can understand it and how it might help us to make a better world in the future, as well as just kind of taking a look at the human condition in general and why we are the way we are. And I apologize to psychology majors if I don't use certain textbook perfect definitions of things about what I'm going to talk about today. But what it relates to is why certain things happen the way they happen. You know, we've got a case in this country right now where following the 9/11 event and the crashing planes into the Twin Towers, we've been at a risk for terrorism. I mean, it seems that every time you turn around, the government is doing everything but trying to catch terrorists. We're at the point now where we're pretty much, let's call it what it is, we're sexually assaulting nuns and 13-year-old girls at airports rather than focusing the attention of our security apparatus where it ought to be, which are people who fit a certain kind of a profile. And I don't mean necessarily racially. I mean that they're, 19, 20-year-old males who've spent a lot of time in places around the world where they hate America, and they have schools that teach you to hate America more, and then they come back in this country and we don't put them under any special scrutiny. And it doesn't matter whether they're from of Arab origin or Asian origin or regular Western Europeans who become radicalized. We aren't focusing our attention on them. We're focusing our attention, it seems, on, well, everybody at large, as though, the 83-year-old grandma from Peoria is going to be the next underwear bomber. Doesn't make any sense in our culture at all. Why do we get there? Is it just the government's stupid, or is it something else? You can also put this in the context of civil unrest of certain kinds of antisocial behavior that people get involved in, or even things like the way that certain politicians, despite evidence that gun ownership reduces crime, they want to turn around and disarm the citizenry rather than concentrating their attention on the actual criminals. It kind of sounds familiar, and it's a pattern that happens over and over again. Well, how does this happen? Just a thought about that, just a theory that I've got. There is something in psychology, and again I apologize to the psychology majors if I'm glossing over this just a little too quickly. It's called the principle of sublimation, and sublimation works like this. Say you're driving down the road one day in your car, and you're on your way to the gym, and somebody cuts you off. They swerve in front of you in your lane, and you gotta quickly maneuver, and you honk your horn, and now you're mad, and you just, your real impulse is to do something very, very violent, and your adrenaline's going, and you're all pushed out of shape. But like most of us, you don't, because you're basically a decent human being, and you stuff that anger down and you get on your way. And like I said, you were on the way to the gym. Well, what you do is you take that anger, the energy of that impulse, of that angry impulse, and you turn it to something that's either neutral or perhaps even beneficial or good. You put that into your workout. You put that anger into your workout. Now you're going to, get that one last bench press out. And it works to your advantage, because you can take that negative, or even if it's not negative, you can just take that emotional energy and move it from one place to the other. Now, for other people, they'll take that energy and they'll do something like they will meditate or engage in prayer, and that energy comes out in a different way. But that energy is dealt with, and it's dealt with consciously, or at least philosophically or religiously or something, so that it doesn't become a problem. Well, then there are other classes of individuals who they don't have an outlet for those negative impulses or those emotional impulses. And so what they end up doing is they end up repressing those feelings and stuffing them down. And later on it comes out in a negative way. They get home and they don't know why exactly, but they're snapping at their kids, and they're kicking the dog, and they're, throwing things at the TV, and they just don't know why. And it's because that energy has to go somewhere. If you get that anger just doesn't go away. It's energy that has to be dealt with. Well, how does that relate to the other things that I've talked about? Well, a lot of times that energy gets pushed into directions unconsciously. That energy's there, and it just flows whatever direction it will. Now, if somebody's got cognitive dissonance going on, say they have a negative impulse, and maybe they're a person who's very much a pacifist, and they don't have a way to rationally focus that angry energy someplace else, and they feel even immoral for being angry or for having angry or violent thoughts towards another human being, you will find that that energy sometimes gets misdirected into ways that are almost contrary of their stated goals. So in the case of, let's take for instance politicians and gun laws, it'll work like this. Something happens, some people get shot, there's a school shooting, something horrible like that, and everybody's mad about that. Well, the politicians that are anti-gun to begin with, they can't conceive of the notion that it's really not the gun that's the problem, it's, you know, the people that are the problem. It's the crazy people that went and shot up that school or that cafeteria or whatever. So they focus, they sublimate and repress their reason, which tells them, if they've studied the statistics, that when law-abiding citizens are allowed to own weapons, these incidents don't happen, or they're cut a lot more quickly because someone's on the scene to deal with it. And that energy gets repressed and then sublimated in a different direction, which in this case means they want to pass laws against gun ownership, which does nothing to solve the problem, actually makes the problem worse, but it allows them to focus that energy in a way that doesn't have them to have to make them deal with their fundamentally illogical position on an issue. Well, in the case of terrorism in the United States of America, something like 9/11 happens, or the shoe bomb, any number of things that happens, and we don't allow ourselves, as certain politicians don't, to say, well, there's the enemy, let's get the enemy, because it's politically correct to not be able to identify that enemy and sort of have this weird kind of thing that I'm just not paying attention to any of the particulars, and that would be wrong. And so now that impulse, that natural impulse to do something about the problem, gets repressed and sublimated, and it gets turned instead on the citizenry at large. So instead of doing the politically incorrect thing and identifying actual terrorists, the TSA instead is groping busty stewardesses and sexually harassing 13-year-old girls, having 7-year-old boys to submit to having their private parts played with by government employees. Those impulses are turned on the citizenry instead of towards our enemies, as they should be. This also has to do, strangely, with a concept called total war. And for almost all of human history, whenever a country would go to war with another country, it would be total war, meaning that when England and France go to war with each other, that France is all in it. All the resources of that society, down to the last man, woman, and child, are arrayed against England, and England's doing it in return. And it's a death struggle. It's a fight to the death. And the only time that war is going to end is when one side has completely destroyed the other to the point where the other cannot fight, and all they can do is throw up their hands and say, whatever, we surrender. Anything, just stop the killing, just stop the destruction, just stop this. We sue for peace. And that's kind of how war went all the way up through human history until World War II, which was the last time, I think, that Western countries at least waged total war. Ever since then, we've waged war which has been kind of a political war. Well, we're going to fight you until you move your troops back above a certain parallel. Or we're going to fight you until we, get you to come to the bargaining table and bargain over some political issue or something like that. Well, we're going to fight you until you agree to some other terms, but we're not really going to war with your whole country. And certainly, most people in those countries don't even think of themselves as war with that whole other country. It's just, well, our military and our politicians are having a war with their military and their politicians until somehow we come together and, sing kumbaya and make this work. Well, what that does when we get rid of the concept of total war is it sublimates the impulses of both the people in government and the people in the military, as well as the population at large. It sublimates those angry impulses to a form where we're no longer doing what's necessary to deal with an actual enemy. And you see, we're dealing with terrorism right now, with an actual enemy worldwide to Western civilization, or civilization in general, if you ask me, because what the terrorists want is some weird, 14th century view of what humanity ought to look like that has nothing to do with what you'd call actual civilization. But we've sublimated that as a culture to the point where we won't say things to ourselves like, no, we are against this particular people. We're against this particular sect of a particular religion which is radicalized. It's very difficult for people to say things like that, like to say, we are at war with radical Islam, period. And we are going to beat the crap out of radical Islam until they are either eradicated or until they say no more, no more, no more. That's a radical notion, and we're not trying to wage total war against even radical Islam because we're afraid of offending people. So what happens is all of those impulses get sublimated and repressed, and they come out in other ways. Now, the ways that they come out are we start fighting each other. We start pointing fingers at each other and saying, it's that politician's fault because he didn't do what he was supposed to do when he was supposed to do it. Or it's that politician's fault. Or, oh, these guys over here, they're evil and they planned the whole thing behind the scenes. It was an inside job. Because we will not let ourselves conceive of an actual enemy requiring us to go to total war. We need to fix that problem. We need to return to the concept of having rational ways to focus our negative energy or our warlike impulses in the face of an actual enemy that we have worldwide, as well as the problems that we have internally in our culture. And until we're willing to do that, until we're willing to call the problems for what they are and call our enemies for what they are, both inside the culture and outside the culture, we're not going to fix anything. That's Zombie Tactics for today. Hopefully something to think about. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.